After the plane went down, the world demanded answers. Where were the black boxes? What did the flight recorders say? The Soviets said they did not know. They said they could not find them. They said they could not locate the wreckage. They were lying. Soviet divers had found the wreckage within days. They had recovered the black boxes. They had listened to the recordings, and they had hidden everything. For 9 years, until the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1992, Yeltsin handed the black boxes over to South Korea. The recordings were analyzed, and the world finally learned the truth. The pilots had no idea what was happening. They never saw the attack coming. Until the very last moment, they thought everything was normal. 269 people died without ever knowing what hit them. This is the story of Korean Air Flight 007, the cold-blooded shootdown that shocked the world, and the lies that buried the truth for nearly a decade. Korean Air Flight 007 departed New York's John F. Kennedy Airport shortly after midnight on August 31, 1983. The Boeing 747 carried 246 passengers and 23 crew members. The passenger list read like a cross-section of the world. Businessmen traveling to Asia, families visiting relatives, students returning to school. 61 Americans, 28 Japanese, 16 Filipinos, 23 other nationalities. Among the passengers was Lawrence McDonald, a United States congressman from Georgia. He was traveling to Seoul for a ceremony commemorating the 30th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. The flight stopped in Anchorage, Alaska for refueling. Passengers stretched their legs. The crew changed shifts. At 5:40 in the morning local time, the plane took off for the final leg to Seoul. Captain Chun Byung-in was an experienced pilot with over 10,000 flight hours. First Officer Sun Dong-hui and Flight Engineer Kim Ui-dong completed the cockpit crew. They had flown this route many times before. The planned route would take them southwest across the Pacific, passing south of the Soviet Union's Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. International airways were carefully designed to avoid Soviet airspace. Every pilot knew to stay clear of the border. Something went wrong almost immediately after takeoff. The exact cause of the navigation error has been debated for decades. The most likely explanation involves the aircraft's autopilot system. The Boeing 747 had multiple navigation modes. One mode, called INS, used inertial navigation to follow a precisely programmed route. Another mode, called heading, simply maintained whatever compass heading was set. Investigators believe the crew inadvertently left the autopilot in heading mode instead of switching to INS. The plane flew a constant magnetic heading instead of following the curved Great Circle route to Seoul. The error was small at first. A few degrees off course, barely noticeable, but over hours of flight, the deviation compounded. The aircraft drifted further and further north. By the time KAL 007 approached the Soviet coast, it was hundreds of kilometers off course. Instead of passing safely south of Kamchatka, it was heading directly toward some of the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Union. The crew should have noticed. They had multiple navigation systems that should have shown the deviation. But cockpit voice recordings later revealed a relaxed atmosphere. The pilots chatted casually. They ate dinner. They seemed completely unaware that anything was wrong. Some investigators have suggested the crew may have intentionally taken a shortcut to save fuel. This theory has never been proven and is rejected by most experts. The simpler explanation is human error. A switch left in the wrong position, a failure to cross-check instruments, the kind of mistake that should never happen, but sometimes does. Whatever the cause, KAL 007 was flying straight in the Soviet airspace, and the Soviets were watching. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. Soviet radar detected KAL 007 as it approached Kamchatka Peninsula. The radar operators saw a large aircraft heading toward their coastline. They assumed it was hostile. The timing was particularly sensitive. That same night, The Soviet Union was conducting a test of a new missile system. American reconnaissance aircraft routinely monitored such tests. The Soviets expected American spy planes to be in the area. In fact, an American RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft was operating nearby. For a time, the radar tracks of KAL-007 and the RC-135 merged on Soviet screens. When they separated, the Soviets may have believed the civilian airliner was actually the spy plane. Fighter jets scrambled from bases on Kamchatka. They climbed to intercept the intruder. But the 747 was flying
at 40,000 feet, and the Soviet fighters had difficulty reaching that altitude.
By the time they got close, KAL-007 had passed over Kamchatka and was heading out over the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviets had another chance when the aircraft approached Sakhalin Island. More fighters scrambled. This time, they would not let the intruder escape. Major Gennady Osipovich was piloting one of the Su-15 interceptors. He was a veteran pilot with years of experience. His orders were clear: identify the intruder, force it to land. If it refused, destroy it. Osipovich closed on the target in the darkness. He could see the aircraft's navigation lights. He could see its silhouette against the stars, but he could not identify what type of aircraft it was. He tried to contact it by radio. No response. He fired warning shots with his cannon. The tracer rounds arced across the sky. The 747 flew on, oblivious. At 18:26 GMT, Osipovich received the order to destroy the target. He armed his missiles and fired. 2 R-98 air-to-air missiles streaked toward the Boeing 747. The first missile struck near the tail, damaging the horizontal stabilizer and severing hydraulic lines. The second missile exploded near the fuselage, sending shrapnel through the cabin and causing rapid decompression. Inside the aircraft, chaos erupted. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The cabin filled with fog as the pressurized air escaped. Passengers screamed. The cockpit voice recorder captured the crew's confusion. "What happened?" someone asked. The flight engineer reported that the cabin was decompressing. Warning alarms blared. Captain Chun struggled to control the aircraft. The hydraulic systems were failing. The control surfaces were not responding properly. The plane began to descend. For 12 agonizing minutes, KAL-007 fell toward the sea. The crew fought to maintain control. They did not know they had been shot down. They thought they had suffered some kind of catastrophic mechanical failure. The black box recordings reveal no panic in the cockpit. The crew remained professional, working through emergency procedures, trying to save their aircraft. They had no idea that Soviet missiles had just killed them. At 18:38 GMT, Korean Air Flight 007 struck the water near Monaran Island, west of Sakhalin. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. All 269 people aboard were killed instantly. The wreckage sank to the seafloor, 300 meters below the surface, and the world began demanding answers. The Soviet Union's initial response was silence. For hours, Moscow said nothing about the missing aircraft. When the Soviets finally spoke, they denied everything. They had not shot down any aircraft. They had no knowledge of any incident. The accusations were American propaganda. This lie lasted less than a day. Too many people had seen what happened. Japanese radar operators had tracked the incident. American intelligence had intercepted Soviet communications. The shootdown could not be hidden. So the Soviets changed their story. Yes, an aircraft had been intercepted, but it was a spy plane, an American reconnaissance aircraft violating Soviet airspace. They had every right to defend their borders. When it became clear that the aircraft was a civilian airliner, the Soviets changed their story again. The aircraft had been flying without navigation lights. It had not responded to warnings. It had behaved like a spy plane. The pilots had no way of knowing it was civilian. None of this was true. The aircraft's lights had been on. Osipovich himself later admitted he could see them. The Boeing 747's distinctive shape should have been recognizable to any experienced pilot, and the crew had responded to Soviet communications. They simply could not hear them because they were on the wrong radio frequency. But the most damaging lie involved the black boxes. Within days of the shootdown, Soviet naval vessels converged on the crash site. Divers descended to the wreckage on the sea floor. They began recovering debris, bodies, and equipment. Among the items recovered were the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. The black boxes, the definitive record of what had happened aboard Cal 007. The Soviets listened to the recordings. They heard the pilot's casual conversation. They heard the complete absence of any espionage activity. They heard ordinary airline crew doing ordinary airline work, unaware that they were about to die. The recordings proved that Cal 007 was exactly what it appeared to be, an innocent civilian aircraft that had strayed off course by accident. The crew had no sinister intentions. They were simply lost. This evidence would have destroyed the Soviet narrative. It would have proven that they had killed 269 innocent people through a combination of paranoia, poor judgment, and trigger-happy military doctrine. So they hid it. The Soviet government announced that they had not found the black boxes. Despite extensive search operations, despite recovery of other debris, despite having the exact coordinates of the crash, they claimed the flight recorders could not be located. The United States and Japan conducted their own search operations. They found debris and human remains, but the black boxes remained missing. The Soviets insisted they did not have them. This lie would persist for 9 years. The shootdown of KAL 007 produced an explosion of international outrage. President Ronald Reagan called it a crime against humanity. He described the act as barbaric, as an act of mass murder. His administration released transcripts of intercepted Soviet communications that appeared to show the pilots knew they were attacking a civilian aircraft. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. The United States introduced a resolution condemning the Soviet Union. The Soviets vetoed it. Their ambassador accused the Americans of deliberately sending the aircraft into Soviet airspace as a provocation. Relations between the superpowers, already tense, deteriorated further. Cultural exchanges were canceled. Trade negotiations stalled. The brief warming trend of the early 1980s reversed completely. Inside the Soviet Union, the government maintained its defensive posture. State media portrayed the incident as an American intelligence operation gone wrong. Soviet citizens were told their military had heroically defended the motherland against foreign aggression. The Korean air shootdown became a symbol of Soviet brutality in the Western world. It reinforced every negative stereotype about communist totalitarianism. It made arms control negotiations nearly impossible for years. And throughout it all, the black boxes sat in a Soviet facility, their contents known only to a handful of officials who had decided the truth was too dangerous to reveal. Gennady Osipovich, the pilot who fired the fatal missiles, became a controversial figure. In the immediate aftermath, he was treated as a hero within the Soviet military. He had followed orders. He had defended Soviet airspace. He received a medal for his actions. But Osipovich himself seemed troubled by what he had done. In interviews years later, he expressed doubts about the incident. He said he had not been certain the aircraft was military. He said he had expected it to land after his warning shots. The warning shots themselves became a point of contention. Osipovich claimed he had fired hundreds of rounds from his cannon, creating a visible display that any pilot should have seen. But investigators noted that his tracer ammunition had been removed for the mission. His warning shots would have been largely invisible in the darkness. Osipovich also claimed the aircraft had no lights and was flying erratically, as if trying to evade interception. The black box recordings would later prove both claims false. The lights were on. The aircraft flew straight and level, making no evasive maneuvers. Why did Osipovich shoot? He was following orders. Soviet doctrine at the time was clear. Unidentified aircraft violating Soviet airspace were to be destroyed if they did not comply with intercept procedures. The pilot on the scene had limited discretion. But Osipovich could have waited. He could have continued to shadow the aircraft as it flew toward international airspace. In minutes, the 747 would have been over the Sea of Japan, beyond Soviet jurisdiction. 269 people would have lived. He chose to fire instead, and he has lived with that choice ever since. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. With it collapsed the apparatus of secrecy that had hidden the Cal 007 evidence for nearly a decade. Boris Yeltsin, president of the new Russian Federation, decided to come clean. In October 1992, he handed over the black boxes to South Korean authorities. He also provided transcripts of Soviet communications from the night of the shootdown. The recordings confirmed what many had suspected. The crew of KAL 007 had no idea they were off course. They never knew they had entered Soviet airspace. They never saw the interceptors. They never heard the warnings. The cockpit voice recorder captured a routine flight until the moment of missile impact. The pilots discussed dinner. They chatted about their schedules. They complained about the weather. Then suddenly, alarms, confusion, decompression, and 12 minutes of desperate struggle to control a mortally wounded aircraft. There was no espionage, no deliberate provocation, no sinister American plot. Just a navigation error that put an innocent aircraft in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The flight data recorder confirmed the navigation mistake. The autopilot had been set incorrectly. The aircraft had drifted north throughout the flight, with the crew unaware of their true position. The truth, hidden for 9 years, was finally known. But for the families of the victims, the revelation came far too late. The families of KAL 007's victims had spent 9 years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. They did not know if the passengers had suffered. They did not know if there had been any warning. They did not know if death had been instantaneous or prolonged. The black box recordings answered some questions. Death had not been instantaneous. The passengers had experienced 12 minutes of terror as the aircraft fell from the sky. But they had probably lost consciousness quickly due to the decompression. Most would not have been aware when the aircraft hit the water. The recordings also raised uncomfortable questions. Why had the Soviets hidden the evidence? What had they feared would be revealed? The answer was simple. The recordings proved Soviet culpability beyond any doubt. They showed that every excuse, every justification, every explanation offered by the Soviet government had been a lie. The crew was not spying. The aircraft was not evading. The passengers were not provocateurs. They were ordinary people on an ordinary flight who died because of Soviet paranoia and a navigation error. The Russian government offered compensation to the victims' families. It was a tacit admission of guilt, though no official apology was ever issued. The pilot, Osipovich, was never prosecuted. The officials who ordered the shootdown were never held accountable. Korean Air Flight 007 remained a wound that never fully healed. The truth had emerged, but justice had not. The Cal 007 tragedy had lasting consequences beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis. One direct result was the decision to make GPS technology available for civilian use. President Reagan announced that the Global Positioning System, then restricted to military applications, would be open to civilian aircraft to prevent similar navigation errors in the future. Today, GPS is ubiquitous. Every smartphone, every car navigation system, every aircraft uses it. The technology that could have saved 269 lives is now taken for granted. The incident also led to changes in international aviation protocols. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, strengthened rules about intercepting civilian aircraft. The presumption shifted toward caution. Military pilots were instructed to exhaust all alternatives before using lethal force against unidentified aircraft. These changes came too late for the passengers of KAL 007, but they may have prevented other tragedies. The shootdown remains controversial decades later. Some researchers continue to argue that the navigation error was too convenient, that there must have been some intelligence operation involved. Others maintain that it was simply a tragic accident compounded by Soviet overreaction. The black boxes settled the factual questions. The crew made a mistake. The Soviets shot them down. Everyone aboard died. But the moral questions remain. How could the Soviets justify killing 269 civilians? How could they lie about it for 9 years? How could the pilot who pulled the trigger receive a medal? The Cold War was a time of fear and paranoia on both sides. KAL-007 showed how that fear could produce monstrous results. 269 people died not because of what they had done, but because of where they were. In the wrong place. At the wrong time. In a world divided by suspicion and armed to the teeth. They paid the ultimate price for the sins of that era. And the black boxes that could have told their story were hidden in Soviet vaults, while the world argued over lies. That is the legacy of Korean Air Flight 007. A tragedy compounded by deception. Truth buried for 9 years. And 269 souls who deserved better than they got.